For a brief meditation, let us turn our attention to John chapter 21, the text that was read to us. The restoration of Peter, the call to discipleship, and we will focus the topic, the calls to discipleship, focusing on the restoration of Peter. Now imagine a star athlete who fails miserably in a championship game. His or her confidence is completely shattered, and he or she assumes that his or her career is almost over. But at this point, the coach meets the person, restores the person, and calls him or her back to the team. That would be an amazing comeback, isn't it? That is exactly what Jesus is doing with Peter in John chapter 21. Peter was almost discouraged after his denial, thinking that his discipleship journey has almost come to an end. But Jesus appears to him and encounters him and encourages him and takes him back into the discipleship network. After Jesus' death and resurrection, Peter and the disciples were so confused about their calling, confused to the extent they went back to fishing. And Jesus meets them at the Sea of Galilee, also known as the Sea of Tiberias, and restores Peter and the disciples and reaffirms their call to discipleship. This is the story we find in John chapter 21. John says that this was the third time Jesus appeared to his disciples post-resurrection. First time, Jesus appeared to the 10 disciples. Thomas was not there. The second appearance happens in John chapter 20, again, while John was there, to the 11 disciples. And this is the third appearance to the 7 disciples at the Sea of Galilee. In this chapter, we see the dissenting or rebellious disciples, the reconciling Jesus, and the recommissioning of Peter. Very simple text, but has profound meaning. So we will meditate this text from the perspective of the call to discipleship and from the encounter Peter had with Jesus. I would like to divide this text chapter into 3 scenes, 3 narratives. The first scene is the descending disciples. We find this in verses 1 to 3. John 21 begins with 7 of Jesus' disciples under the leadership of Peter resuming their lives by returning to Galilee and going back to fishing. Peter still is leading the team, and so when he says, "I'm going fishing," 7 of the disciples followed him. 7 of them: Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, the sons of Zebedee, that is James and John, and 2 other disciples whose names are not given. 7 out of 11, that is the majority, about 65-70%. 7 out of 11, they passed a no-confidence motion on Jesus and went back to the starting point from where they started to follow Jesus. Maybe the number 7 is a symbolic of the entire group, because the focus is on the leader of the group, Peter. He was the one who organized this fishing project. Instead of bringing his friends back to Jesus, instead of networking them back to Christ, he is actually taking them away from Jesus, away to a place where they were before 3.5 years. They were just in the exact spot 3.5 years before they started following Jesus. In some sense, they have come a full circle. Started the journey from the Sea of Galilee, followed Jesus for 3.5 years, now back to the shores of Galilee to square one. You might be wondering what they are doing in Galilee. Shouldn't they be in Jerusalem, the epicenter of religious activities of that time? John does not tell us why the disciples are back in Galilee, but in fact they are instructed to go to Galilee by Jesus himself. In Matthew chapter 28, twice, once by an angel and also the second time through the women, Jesus instructed the disciples to be in Galilee. They obeyed Jesus partially. They obeyed partially this command. They arrived in Galilee, but instead of waiting patiently for the Lord's direction, they took matters into their own hands. As a result, they experienced one of the most discouraging nights of their lives, one of the most defeating nights of their lives. It was a night of complete defeat. All of them were experts in fishing, but they terribly failed in their attempt that night. It was a night of defeat, not because they were in Galilee, but because they were doing what was right in their own eyes, without waiting for the Lord's instruction. Not because they were incompetent fishermen, but because they trusted their own strength in their assignment, in their project. What we notice is everything in this scene speaks of defeat. First, John says it was night, dark, verse 3. Probably a picture that Peter was no longer walking in the light. Darkness in John's gospel signifies something evil. For example, John chapter 3, verse 2, we find Nicodemus coming to see Jesus at night, a picture describing his spiritual darkness. Or in John chapter 13, verse 30, when Judas went out to betray Jesus, John says that it was night. Once again, a picture suggesting that Judas Iscariot's evil action and that he was walking in darkness. So the reference to night, darkness is significant. Second, their fishing enterprise ends in utter failure. Verse 3, that night they caught nothing. They caught zero, nothing. How frustrated they must have been, they must have felt when time after time they lowered the nets only to pull them back empty. The whole night they tried and they faced only defeat. Once again, it's a great picture of someone outside of God's will. Third, the indication that Peter and his company were outside of God's will is indicated by the fact that they were not able to recognize Jesus, even though they were standing just few feet away from the shore. Verse 4, early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. This is exactly an example of rock becoming sand. John carefully places Petros, the rock, on the beach sand in his closing episode. When we lose confidence on Jesus and focus our attention on something else, we become sand. This teaches us one of the central lessons of discipleship is that the acknowledgement that apart from Jesus, we can do nothing. One of the central, very important lesson of discipleship is the acknowledgement that apart from Jesus, we can do nothing. John chapter 15, verse 5, Jesus said this teaching to the disciples, I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me, you can do nothing. Jesus had taught this lesson several times, because in the Gospels, never ever the disciples catch fish without the support of Jesus, without the help of Jesus. There is not even one recorded fishing attempt that was successful without the help of Jesus. Isn't there a lesson for us? In our discipleship journey, we must trust God not only in our weaknesses, but also in our strengths. Trust God not only in our weaknesses, but also in our strengths. Too often we rely on God when we feel inadequate, yet depend on ourselves in areas where we feel capable, where we feel we are gifted and talented. But true discipleship means surrendering everything, both our weakness and our strength, to God, to Christ. Peter, stepping outside his call, found only failure. It is a lesson for us that the safest place is to be at the center of God's will. Are we, like Peter, tempted to return to our old ways when discouraged? When life feels uncertain, do we seek comfort in familiar routines rather than trusting in God's plan? True discipleship means following Jesus' calling, not our comfort zones. Following Jesus' calling, not our comfort zone. True discipleship is following God's direction even when the path ahead seems unclear. Like Peter, we may fail at times, but Jesus calls us back, not to what is easy, but to what is right. He calls us back, not to our comforts, but to what is right from His side. So the second lesson is scene 2, verses 4 to 14, the reconciling Jesus. The reconciling Jesus. This leads to the second part of the narrative that speaks about the reconciling Jesus. Instead of dumping these disciples who had passed a no confidence motion on Him, we find Jesus coming in search of them to the shore. Jesus takes the initiative. Jesus takes the initiative. He comes to them first, showing grace even when they were drifting away. Verse 4 to 6. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore and called out to them. What did He refer them? Children, have you any fish? Here, children are more literally little children. No, it is one of the most compassionate way of addressing one's companion. That is the word that Jesus chooses. Children are literally little children. Jesus did not rebuke them for returning to fishing or call them unfaithful. He called them children, the most compassionate way to address one's companion. This shows the deep concern and love, reminding them that even in their discouragement and uncertainty, they still belong to Him. The father-children relationship is not gone away. Even in times of failure, even in discouragement and uncertainty, the acknowledgement that you belong to me, that is what children refers to. Addressing them as children, Jesus asks a question, do you have any fish? In the Greek language, you can ask a question expecting a negative answer. The structure of the question will itself determine whether the answer is a yes or no. So here, Jesus, knowing that they did not catch any fish, asks, you haven't got any fish, have you? The disciples understood that Jesus is aware of their failure. So, in an embarrassed way, they very briefly answer, no. Embarrassed, they admit their failure. No, we have not caught anything. Jesus says, throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some. When they did, they got so many fish that they were not able to pull the boat to the shore. Most commentators see these fish as symbolic of the missionary work of the disciples, similar to Jesus' original call, initial call, come follow me, I will make you fishers of men. While the miraculous catch points to their future calling as fishers of men or fishers of people, the scene that follows highlights something even more profound: Jesus' grace and love for His disciples. Instead of confronting them for their failures, He prepares a delicious breakfast for them, for the disciples who deserted them. Verse 9. When they reached the shore, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish on it and bread. Charcoal fire in a breezy beach, fresh baked bread and fried fish. What a scene. The charcoal fire was probably a reminder to Peter of his denial around another fire where in the high priest's court he denied Jesus, saying, I did not even know Him. But unlike Peter's denial by that fire, Jesus now invites him to a restoring meal of this fire. Imagery of a cooking Jesus is something that impressed me. Cooking for deserters who passed no confidence motion on Jesus. The only physical work that Jesus did after resurrection is cooking food for the disciples. Cooking real bread and fish with the help of charcoal in the breezy beach, willing to dirty His glorified body with the ashes of the charcoal. Remember that He is in the glorified body. This is the epitome of Christ's love. For me, the image of a cooking Jesus expresses Christ's love as much as the cross symbolizes his love. No commentators say this is a miracle. That means Jesus physically baked bread and fried fish for the disciples. He caught the fish. He brought the flour. He mixed the dough. He lit the fire. And went through the process of baking and frying. In fact, while the disciples were backsliding from him, he was actually preparing food for them. It shows the effort that Jesus takes to bring a person back into his network. The effort that he takes to bring a person back to discipleship. That is the epitome of Christ's love. It is like something like investing on failed businessmen. Nobody likes to invest on failed business. Now, Christianity today has become more and more corporate cultured, where the sole aim is to make profit. But Jesus was willing to invest on these failed little ones. Note that Jesus not only accepts Peter, but he accepts an imperfectly repentant Peter. Jesus does not rebuke Peter, but restores him through his love. That's the lesson for us. Jesus doesn't abandon us in our failures. He meets us where we are. He meets us where we are. Just as he prepared a meal for the disciples, he is preparing what is required for us, or he has prepared what is required for us, the grace, the restoration, and the renewed purpose. His love is not distant. He doesn't work through merely agents. His love is very personal. He himself comes to us. That is why the glorified Jesus spent 40 days training the disciples, equipping them further to prepare them for discipleship. And after making Peter feel comfortable, and after fulfilling his physical needs, including food, Jesus takes Peter to the next stage of discipleship, the recommissioning of him. So the third scene is the recommissioning of Peter, verse 15 to 17, or up to verse 19, the recommissioning of Peter. After the meal, Jesus recommissions Peter through a simple but heart-piercing question. And Jesus asked the same question 3 times. What is the question? Simon, son of John, do you truly love me? Simon, son of John, do you truly love me? Yes, Lord, Peter said, you know that I love you. And Jesus, in response, said, feed my sheep. Take care of my sheep. 3 times, Peter had denied Jesus publicly, and Jesus gives him 3 opportunities to confess his love publicly. Notice how Jesus refers to Peter. The Apostle Paul, the writing of the gospel, he refers to Peter as Simon Peter, the new name, referring to the new name. He refers to Peter as Simon Peter in verse 2, verse 7, verse 15, and throughout. But in contrast, Jesus doesn't mention his new name, Peter, but Jesus deliberately uses the old name, Simon, son of John. Now, if you read verse 15, very clearly it says, when they finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, this is the description of the narrator, the author. And then the quote begins. The quote is the saying of Jesus. Simon, son of John, do you love me more than this? With the name Simon, Jesus takes Peter way back to the start of the relationship. He is taking him back to basics, where he started his relationship. The 3 questions have some message for us concerning God's love and grace. Now, the first question Jesus asks is, do you love me more than these? Do you love me more than these? Here, the word these isn't identified. We do not know who are these. Or there are 2 possibilities. One, it could mean that more than these refers to the fish, the boats, the fishing net, referring to his occupation and Peter's first love, fishing. And second, it could also mean these men, referring to the disciples. I think Jesus is referring Peter back to his statement in Matthew chapter 26, verse 33, where he very proudly no, very arrogantly said, even if all the disciples desert you, I will never do that. So probably Jesus is reminding Peter of that statement and saying, do you still claim to have a deeper love for me than all of these disciples? The Greek word for love here is agape, the verb form, the highest form of love. That is the word that Jesus uses to Peter. Do you agape me? Do you love me? Peter affirms by saying, yes, Lord, but by using another word, phileo, meaning friendship or affection. Peter was very careful in using the words. He was honest and told the truth. He said, Lord, you know that I love you, but not the highest form of love. But maybe I have affectionate for you. I have a friendly, brotherly love. This response shows that Peter is no longer the boaster, the self-confident man he used to be, because his humble response does not claim to truly love agapao Jesus, but only love phileo him. Peter's choice of words simply shows from now on he is going to be careful with the words. Now, in response to this answer, Jesus gives Peter a commission, feed my lamb. And in verse 16, we find the second question. Second time Jesus said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? What we notice here is, in repeating the question, Jesus sensitively drops the second phrase, more than this. The second question, Jesus never says, do you love me more than this? It is a simple, do you love me? So this new format takes the pressure off Peter. Jesus is trying to make Peter more comfortable. Rather than comparing Peter's love to that of others, Jesus now makes it personal, focusing solely on Peter's own commitment. And the second time also, Peter answers, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. But again, phileo, not agape. So accepting Peter's humble response, Jesus changes the vocabulary. So Jesus says, okay, Peter, if you are not able to come to my level, I will come to your level. And he asks the third time, do you phileo me? Do you love me? In his third question, Jesus seems to say to Peter, if you like the word phileo so much, don't worry, I will use that same word. So Jesus says, Simon, are you affectionate of me? The word for love shifts from sacrificial love to brotherly love. Jesus meets Peter at his level and lifts him up. What a humble Savior we have. Peter did not expect this, so he breaks down. So the following verses shows that he is really moved by the compassion of Jesus. Throughout this dramatic and personal movement, Christ's commission remains consistent. I want you to do something for me. Feed my lamb. Jesus lets Peter and the other disciples know that he has not given himself on Simon Peter. He has not abandoned him. In three responses from Peter, the memory of his denials are completely wiped off. The slate is wiped clean. A new call to discipleship. Peter is no longer just a follower, but a shepherd of God's people. No, there's an illustration. Once a mischievous person entered the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, and with a hammer, he began to smash Michelangelo's beautiful sculpture, the Pieta. No, the cherished artwork was severely damaged. But what the officials did they throw away the art and forget about it? No, they did not do that. Using the best experts, they worked with utmost care and precision and made every effort to restore that masterpiece back to life. That is exactly what happens here. Jesus is restoring Peter back to discipleship. The lesson for us is, by his sovereign grace, God, the master restorer, can bring good out of our failures for his glory. Whatever our past may be, like Peter, Jesus stands to forgive and restore us. He gives us another chance, the second chance. He does everything to bring us back into the network. Even when he could choose someone else, he doesn't do that because his grace is greater than our limitations. If only God uses perfect people, I don't think He can use anyone because there is no perfect people. Instead, God uses people who love Him. So it's not our gifts and talents that qualify us, it is our love for Him that qualifies us. Not people who love Him with some superhuman love, but those who love Him with a simple love, like Peter, honest in love, not pretend to be love. Yes, Lord, I cannot love you to that level. I can only love you to this level. That was Peter's acknowledgement. People who are honest in their love. Honest love is the password for discipleship. Love with responsibility. Every time Peter said, yes, Lord, I love you, Jesus gave him new responsibility. Not a reward, possibly it was a responsibility. The underlying message here is that love for Christ is the only acceptable motive for serving Him. Love that is characterized by humility, honesty, dependence, and obedience. The lesson for us is if we follow Christ for fame or wealth, our faith will falter. If we follow Christ for fame or wealth, at some point of life, some point of time, we will feel discouraged. But if we follow Him out of genuine love for Him, we will stand firm and never be disappointed. This recommissioned Peter became one of the greatest apostles in the early church. One of the famous figures we know among all of the disciples. We know him as the preacher on the day of Pentecost. On a single sermon, 3,000 people were added to the church. We know him as the spokesperson of the church in Jerusalem. We know him as the bold spokesperson of the disciples who would dare to say on the face of persecution, we must obey God rather than people. In conclusion, as we observe UBS Sunday, for all of us, whether we are in seminary or as believers, Peter's story is a reminder that our calling is not based on our perfection, but on our love for Jesus. There will be moments of doubt, there will be moments of failure and discouragement in the journey to discipleship. But don't worry, Jesus doesn't abandon us. He meets us, He restores us, and recommissions us. He never leaves us until He brings us back to the network. He takes every effort to bring us back, to restore us back. As future church leaders, missionaries, and servants of God, let our motivation not be success, recognition, or security, but a deep, deep sense of love for our Savior. If our calling is rooted in love for Him, no challenge can shake us, no adversity can trouble us. May God help us to follow Him, not out of fear or personal ambition, but out of sincere love for Christ. May He strengthen us to rise from our failures, embrace His restoration, and walk confidently in our journey to discipleship. And may our lives be a testimony of His grace as we serve Him with humility, obedience, and unwavering devotion.